is love. We are all on a quest, a voyage, and that route is different for each of us. Elizabeth O'Connor, in her book, Journey Inward, Journey Outward, writes, "Every step of one's own is worth more than all the knowledge and insights of others." We can learn, certainly, from the example and wisdom of others, but it is God's intervention in our lives that experientially increases our understanding and faith. In our wishes, small urgings, dreams, fantasies, experiences, we are given intimations of the way we are to go. It is the small voice of the Holy Spirit leading us along. I have to admit that I haven't always been happy with God's plans and interventions in my life. In fact, at times I've been bent over and exceedingly miserable and wondering and questioning just what His intentions are for me. But I do believe as we mature and grow in faith and wisdom, we can look back and see that God has indeed been always present and leading us along. Wendell Berry's character in his book, Jayber Crow, reflects, "Nearly everything that has happened to me has happened by surprise. And whatever has happened usually has happened before I had time to expect it. And so when I thought I was in my story, or in charge of it, I have really only been on the edge of it, carried along. Is this because we are in an eternal story that is happening partly in time? I'm remembering those early years where I was cut completely adrift. And sometimes when looking back, it seems I had been wandering in dark woods of error. But now it looks to me as though I was following the path that was laid out for me, unbroken, and maybe even as straight as possible, from one end to the other. And I have this feeling, which never leaves me anymore, that I have been led." I recently came across a booklet by my uncle, S. Bruce Fleming. He had written about events in his life which he titled From the Orphanage to the Pulpit. He had given it to me years ago with a nice inscription to me, and finding and reading it again somewhat inspired this sermon. He was born of Scotch-Irish immigrant parents in Paris, Maine, one of 9 children. His father was killed in World War I, and his mother, who didn't receive a widow's pension, was unable to care for the large family alone. She placed my uncle and his twin sister, ages 3, and a younger brother in a Christian orphanage in New Britain, Connecticut, where she thought they would be well cared for. There were 180 children in the orphanage, and he has no clear memory of those early days, but remembers frequently being lonely and weeping, and wondering why he was separated from his mother and other siblings, and feeling great joy when his dear mother was able to make her infrequent visits. When he was about 8 years old and in a dormitory with 60 other boys, he lay awake one night unable to sleep because of a severe toothache. He dared not cry aloud as he knew the older boys would express their displeasure. He had heard about prayer in chapel, and even though he understood little about the truths of God, he prayed, "God, if you are there, please help me." And then he began to weep softly. Suddenly a flashlight shone in his face, and the matron quietly asked him what was wrong. When she heard about his toothache, she said, "Follow me," and was very sweet and kind to him, and apparently gave him some aspirin and put something on his tooth to help the pain. When he returned to his bed, he thanked God and marveled that a God who had created the whole universe cared about helping a little boy on a dark night in an orphanage. It was a beginning of his journey of faith. He wrote that he owed a great deal of his early interest in Christianity to a matron hired to work at the home when he was 13, who for some reason beyond his understanding often spoke to him kindly of God's love and of committing his life to Jesus Christ. One day she spoke to him of her sister and brother-in-law, who owned a large farm in Minnesota and had big machinery to raise wheat, oats, and soybeans. He was fascinated and thought it would be wonderful to drive a big tractor. The next year, at age 15, he was determined to leave the orphanage, and this matron arranged for and accompanied him to her relative's farm in Warren, Minnesota, where he would work but also be able to finish high school. The family would take him to church with them, and he began to recognize God's call in his life to ministry. After his junior year in high school, Uncle Bruce determined that farming definitely wasn't for him, and he wanted to go on to college and seminary. He hitchhiked to St. Paul to try and enroll at then Bethel Academy. He had 2 changes of underwear, 1 sweater, 2 shirts, and only $1 or $2 in his pocket. It was during the Great Depression, and jobs were scarce. When he tried to register for senior classes, he was told that without work or funds, he was not able to register. It was late in the day by then, and he didn't know what he should do. He was going to try and sneak into the men's dorm and use the bathroom to clean up, and perhaps find a place to sleep, but all the doors were locked by the time he decided to do that. There were several cars in the parking lot, and he went from car to car until he found one that was unlocked, and crawled in the back seat, laid awake half the night and cried. Finally, he decided to pray, telling God he had come all this way to be a minister, and saying, I want to go to school and to preach. I have nowhere to turn. You must help me, God. I have no other way to go. After praying, he felt that God was with him, that he was not alone. The next morning, he ventured into the men's dorm to wash up. And when the registration office opened, he again went in and was asked the same questions. Did he have the money to pay for the first year? Did he have a job? When the answer was again no to both questions, he was told, we're sorry, but we can't accept you. As he was leaving, he passed the desk of the woman who was placing female students in homes of people seeking housekeeping help. She was on the phone with a woman saying, all the girls have been placed. We have no one available. Before she could hang up, Uncle Bruce quickly interjected, stop. Ask the woman seeking someone to work in a private home if she will take a young man. I'll work a month, and if I do not do a good job, I will walk away. The woman said, send him to me and we'll see what happens. For 2 years, he took care of their home, was paid an honest wage, given room and board, and treated like one of the family. God had answered his prayer. His second year in that home, he was told by the family they would be out of town for the Thanksgiving holiday. The husband apologized that there would be no dinner in the house and gave him $2 to eat in a restaurant. Knowing he would need the $2 for tuition, Bruce walked to a grocery store and bought a can of Franco-American spaghetti for a few cents and wondered where he could enjoy his Thanksgiving dinner. He found the Bethel boiler room door unlocked and heated up his can of spaghetti on a boiler steam pipe, and thought it was one of his best Thanksgiving ever because he had been given the means to attend school. He met my wonderful Aunt Ostrin, my dad's sister, when he was a student pastor in Duluth. They were later married, and that is how he joined the large Crown family, which he embraced as his own. He joyfully served in both small and large congregations, was a wonderful, devoted, charismatic, and caring pastor who was genuinely interested in and remarkably able to connect with people. He was also a great orator who definitely had received the gift of preaching. And he focused on the overwhelming prodigal grace and love of God, and his churches always grew. He felt that his life was full, that he had been led and blessed by God, and he wanted his life to be marked by the one quality Jesus said would describe his followers. All people will know you are my disciples if you love one another. I believe people recognize that quality in him. He and Ostrand had a summer cabin on Lake Vermilion, and after I moved here, I spent many delightful hours with them. I remember him telling me they enjoyed attending St. James Presbyterian Church in Tower once a summer, as he appreciated hearing the pastor who was serving at that time. When I was seeking a new church, that is one of the reasons I walked through those doors back there. I decided to visit St. James, and I know Uncle Bruce would be pleased to know that I'm now preaching here on our campus. Probably quite surprised. Bruce related a meaningful story that happened when he was ministering in the Stanfield area of Minnesota, which he referred to as roses in the snow. It was a Christmas day, crisp, snowy, and cold, 15 degrees below zero. He had led an early 6 a.m. service, and then he and Ostrand and their young daughter had returned to the nearby parsonage. The Great Northern Railroad at that time had passenger trains which ran between Minneapolis and Duluth, which operated every day of the year with precision and regularity. And one of their stops was Stanfield. You could take the train from Minneapolis, spend an hour in Stanfield, and catch the southbound train back to Minneapolis. When the train stopped that Christmas morning, only one lone passenger got off and made his way slowly across the church grounds into the cemetery to a particular gravesite, where he knelt in the snow, bowed his head, and laid a dozen roses on the grave. Bruce asked Ostrand if he thought they should invite him in for a cup of warm coffee and a roll, and she said that he evidently wants to be alone, and we ought not to invade his private thoughts and interfere with his personal vigil. After some time, the man walked back to the depot and caught the southbound train back to Minneapolis. Bruce felt compelled to go and see which grave he had visited, and said it was a sacred moment for him when he saw the name of the family who he had known well. They were immigrants who had come to America to find hope, a productive farm, and a place to raise a family. They had spoken to him often of their concern for their only son, and had covenanted with Uncle Bruce to never stop praying for their son. He knew something good had come to their son on that Christmas day in the cemetery, that he had been met by God. Excuse me, the older I get, the more teary I get. Never used to cry when I was young. Nothing moved me. The next day, without telling anyone, he drove to Minneapolis to find this man and had a wonderful visit with him. He told Uncle Bruce, "I grew up on the farm. I rejected all moral and Christian values of the church, the community, my parents. I prided myself on being a raw recalcitrant. For years, my mother and father prayed for me. I came to the cemetery yesterday to somehow commit myself to the tenets of the Christian faith and life. There at my parents' graveside, I received the Christ of Bethlehem into my life. I regret my waywardness, but rejoice that at last I have found peace in my soul. And somehow I feel my parents know. God does lead his dear children along through all the beauty, joys, struggles, blindness, wanderings, sufferings, and transitions of life. Our broken fragments are transformed into an eternal continuity that keeps us. The way is long, let us go together. The way is difficult, let us help each other. The way is joyful, let us shape it. Let us go in love. Amen.
I told you that this is a song that's new to us, and if you're looking at it on page 46, it's a little tricky. So please forgive any clinkers that come from the I'll do the first praise and then we'll kind of see how it goes.